Picture a classic mid-century American morning, captured in the stark, high-contrast colors of Kodachrome film. It's 1954. The streets are lined with gleaming two-tone sedans. The manicured lawns of suburbia are perfectly green, and the local bank stands as a monument of absolute, impenetrable security. Heavy marble floors, polished brass teller cages, and at the very back, a massive, multi-ton steel vault. But when the bank manager turns the heavy brass dial that morning, the mechanical click of the tumblers echoes through an entirely empty room. The stacks of sequential bills, the canvas bags of silver half-dollars, the locked safety deposit boxes, all gone. Yet the massive steel door was fully locked from the outside. There are no scorch marks from a cutting torch. There is no smell of burnt ozone or cordite in the air. There are no fingerprints, no muddy footprints on the pristine linoleum, and no witnesses. The thief didn't just rob the bank. He seemingly dissolved through the solid steel walls. The FBI was called in to investigate a simple robbery, but what they found was a ghost story. A classified phantom who tore a hole through the illusion of 1950s safety and left a trail of empty vaults across the country. Welcome to the Wayne Archive, where we dust off the classified, the forgotten, and the unexplained. In the golden age of the 1950s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation prided itself on being an unstoppable modern scientific force. They had fingerprint labs, advanced ballistics, and a heavily manicured public image of absolute control. Criminals of the era were usually blunt instruments, men who used heavy Thompson submachine guns, stolen getaway cars, and brute force to crack safes. But the man buried deep within this specific, highly classified FBI file was different. He didn't use explosives. He didn't take hostages. He operated with a terrifying, surgical precision that completely baffled the greatest detectives of the 20th century. He treated the heavy, imposing architecture of the American banking system like a child's puzzle, disassembling it from the inside out without leaving a single trace of his physical existence. Today, we are opening a heavily redacted file to reconstruct the timeline of the ultimate locked room mystery. We are tracking a mastermind who outsmarted the Bureau, executing a string of impossible heists that remain officially unsolved to this very day. Hit that subscribe button, lower the blinds, and let's step back into the shadows of 1954. To understand the sheer, paralyzing confusion that gripped the FBI, we have to examine the geometry of the very first documented strike. It was a crisp, damp Tuesday morning in November 1954, in a quiet, affluent suburb just outside of Chicago. The town was the absolute epitome of corkboard's war American dream, quiet, orderly, and entirely predictable. At precisely 7:45 a.m., Arthur Pendleton, senior branch manager, arrived to open the First National Bank. Pendleton was a man defined by routine. His heavily wrinkled, age-spotted hands moved with practiced, mechanical precision as he deactivated the perimeter alarms. He walked across the cold, echoing expanse of the marble lobby toward the main vault. The vault was a masterpiece of mid-century industrial engineering. It featured a diebold spherical steel door, weighing approximately 15 tons, secured by 4 massive solid steel locking bolts, and governed by a complex dual-combination time lock. It was, by all architectural standards, a fortress. Pendleton inserted his key, dialed the first sequence, and waited for the head teller to input the second. The heavy internal mechanisms clanked, the air seal hissed, and the massive door swung outward on its heavy, greased hinges. But the moment the harsh fluorescent lights flickered on inside the vault, the routine shattered. The central cash carts, usually stacked high with banded, untraceable $20 bills, were stripped completely bare. The heavily reinforced secondary lockboxes, which housed the bank's gold reserves and high-value bonds, hung wide open. The locks hadn't been drilled or blasted. They had been seamlessly, surgically picked. Within the hour, the local police perimeter was completely superseded by federal authorities. Sharp-suited FBI field agents, wearing heavy wool trench coats and wide-brimmed fedoras, swarmed the pristine mid-century lobby. They immediately initiated a forensic lockdown, expecting to find the standard, sloppy hallmarks of a professional crew. A job of this magnitude usually required heavy oxyacetylene cutting torches, diamond-tipped drills, and at least 3 men to haul the physical weight of the currency. But as the lead forensic examiner dusted every single polished surface with black carbon powder, the chilling reality of the crime scene began to materialize. The vault was completely, unnervingly sterile. There were no microscopic traces of metal shavings on the floor. There were no residual drops of machine oil. The FBI vacuumed the carpeted areas just outside the vault, searching for stray cotton fibers from clothing or soil samples from the bottom of a shoe. They found absolutely nothing that didn't belong to the bank employees. The air inside the vault didn't hold the heavy, lingering stench of nervous sweat, cheap aftershave, or the stale cigarette smoke that usually permeated crime scenes of that era. Furthermore, the external perimeter of the bank was flawless. The heavy barred windows were untouched. The roof access hatch was bolted shut from the inside, covered in an undisturbed, thick layer of industrial city dust. The most terrifying piece of the puzzle, however, was the time lock. The internal mechanics of the Diebold vault recorded exactly when the locking bolts were engaged and disengaged. According to the heavy paper drum spinning on the vault's internal clock, the door had been locked by Pendleton at 5:05 p.m. the previous evening. It did not register an opening until 7:45 a.m. that morning. It was a physical, mechanical impossibility. The thief had somehow bypassed the perimeter alarms, bypassed the locked front doors, bypassed the heavy steel vault, extracted over $200,000 in dead weight, and vanished, all without ever triggering a single mechanical relay or leaving a microscopic trace of his physical body. The FBI quietly classified the case file under the heading Unknown Subject. They assumed it was a bizarre, highly localized inside job. They assumed it was a singular anomaly, but they were wrong. 3 weeks later, in a completely different state, the ghost struck again, executing the exact same impossible procedure, and the Bureau realized they were hunting a shadow. 21 days after the Chicago anomaly, the harsh mechanical clatter of a teletype machine echoed through the labyrinthine, smoke-filled corridors of the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The message arriving on the wire shattered the Bureau's hope that the first heist was an isolated event. It had happened again, this time in the dead of winter in Cleveland, Ohio. The target was a prominent downtown financial trust, a building surrounded by the heavy, gleaming chrome grills of parked 1953 Mercury Montereys and sleek, two-tone Studebakers. But despite the bustling, vibrant Kodachrome reality of the city outside, the interior of the bank was a classic noir nightmare. The vault, a massive, heavily reinforced Mosler Safe Company masterpiece designed to withstand a direct blast from military-grade explosives, had been stripped completely bare. Once again, there was absolutely no sign of forced entry. The heavy steel locking bolts were perfectly intact. The time lock registered a flawless overnight seal, and the pristine, waxed linoleum floor held absolutely no trace of an intruder. The ghost had returned, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation was officially in a state of quiet, classified panic. The director dispatched a specialized, elite technical division to the Cleveland crime scene. These were not local beat cops. These were federal agents dressed in the strict, uncompromising 1950s attire that defined the era. Sharp, charcoal gray wool suits, heavily starched white collars, narrow silk ties, and wide-brimmed fedoras pulled low against the freezing rain. They set up massive, blindingly bright halogen work lamps inside the darkened vault, casting long, sharp, cinematic shadows across the empty safety deposit boxes. They approached the crime scene with forensic desperation. They dismantled the Mosler vault door piece by heavy piece, laying out the massive brass tumblers, the heavy steel gears, and the delicate clockwork springs on velvet cloths. They examined every single microscopic millimeter of the metal under high-powered jeweler's loops, searching for the telltale scratches of a lockpick, the scorch of a thermal lance, or the chemical residue of an acid wash. They found absolutely nothing. The metal was pristine. The mechanics were flawless. Back at the field office, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Detectives sat in dimly lit, unventilated rooms, the air thick with the acrid, stale blue smoke of unfiltered Lucky Strikes. They stared at corkboards covered in glossy, high-contrast black and white crime scene photos, desperately trying to construct a psychological profile of an invisible man. The theories grew increasingly desperate and bizarre. Was the thief a highly trained contortionist, capable of hiding inside a standard-sized safety deposit box before the vault was sealed? The FBI physically measured the internal dimensions of the boxes, It was biologically impossible for a human skeleton to fit. Was he utilizing the HVAC ventilation shafts? Agents dressed in heavy coveralls crawled through the ductwork of the Cleveland Bank, only to find the heavy cast-iron grates bolted securely from the outside, coated in an undisturbed, thick layer of industrial soot that proved they hadn't been moved in decades. The most terrifying realization was that traditional law enforcement was entirely unequipped to fight an adversary who refused to play by the established physical rules of the criminal underworld. This wasn't a bank robber. This was a phantom who viewed the heavy, imposing architecture of 1950s security as nothing more than a mild inconvenience. The Bureau realized that the thief possessed a level of mechanical engineering knowledge that rivaled the men who built the vaults. He knew exactly how to manipulate the microscopic tolerances of the tumblers without leaving a single microscopic scratch. But more importantly, he possessed a terrifying psychological patience. He didn't rush. He didn't make mistakes. He was executing a flawless, invisible war against the American banking system, and he was winning. The FBI quietly issued a classified nationwide alert, placing every major metropolitan bank under covert surveillance. They were no longer trying to solve the previous crimes. They were setting a trap for the next one, hoping the ghost would finally make a mistake. By the spring of 1955, the FBI had utilized complex geographic profiling and financial intelligence to anticipate the ghost's next target. The crosshairs fell on a heavily fortified, high-tier commercial bank in the affluent financial district of Boston, Massachusetts. The Bureau decided to execute a massive, unprecedented covert stakeout. They were going to catch the phantom in the act. The operation was straight out of a classic noir thriller. It was a torrential, relentless downpour, the heavy rain slicking the cobblestone streets and reflecting the harsh, yellow glare of the streetlights. Teams of federal agents were crammed into unmarked dark green 1954 Plymouth Savoys parked at strategic vantage points around the perimeter of the bank. The rhythmic, hypnotic slap of the heavy rubber windshield wipers was the only sound inside the vehicles. In the building directly across the street, a specialized surveillance team had established a blind behind closed Venetian blinds. They were operating a heavy, mechanical 16mm surveillance camera, the internal gears whirring quietly in the darkness as they filmed the front entrance of the bank continuously, desperate to capture a single, grainy frame of the intruder. The FBI had the building surrounded by an impenetrable, invisible net. Every single alleyway, every roof hatch, every subterranean sewer access point was physically guarded by armed federal agents. No one went in. No one came out. The agents drank terrible, bitter coffee from heavy steel thermoses, fighting the heavy weight of exhaustion, their eyes glued to the heavy brass doors of the bank. They waited through the darkest, coldest hours of the morning, their hands resting on the cold steel of their service revolvers, fully expecting a violent, explosive confrontation. But the street remained completely, eerily dead. The sun finally broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting the bright, optimistic Kodachrome light of a 1950s morning across the city. The stakeout had seemingly failed. The ghost hadn't shown up. At precisely 8 a.m., the bank president arrived, flanked by 2 armed security guards. He unlocked the front doors and walked across the lobby to initiate the opening sequence of the massive central vault. The exhausted FBI agents, smelling of damp wool and stale tobacco, converged on the lobby to clear the scene. The bank president turned the heavy brass wheel, the massive locking bolts retracted with a heavy metallic thud, and the massive steel door swung open. The FBI agents froze in absolute, paralyzing horror. The vault was completely empty. The money was gone. The psychological devastation inside that lobby was absolute. The agents had maintained a flawless, 360-degree perimeter. They had continuous, unbroken 16mm film footage, proving that not a single human being had approached that building in the last 14 hours. And yet, the interior of the vault had been entirely gutted. It was at this exact moment, staring into the echoing, empty steel cavern, that the lead investigator realized the sheer, undeniable genius of the phantom. The robbery hadn't happened during the night. It hadn't happened while the FBI was watching the building. The thief had executed the heist during normal, broad daylight business hours the previous day. He hadn't broken in. He had walked straight through the front doors. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored wool suit, wearing a fedora, carrying a standard leather briefcase, blending perfectly into the sea of 1950s businessmen. His ultimate camouflage was looking exactly like the people he was robbing. He had engineered a way to bypass the internal security, access the vault during the chaotic rush of the afternoon, empty the cash into his briefcase, and seamlessly manipulate the internal mechanics of the time lock to show a false overnight seal. He had locked the bank out of its own money, walked past the tellers with a polite nod, and disappeared into the bustling city streets hours before the FBI even arrived to set up their trap. He had made fools of the greatest investigative agency in the world. The Boston heist was the final confirmed strike of the Phantom. After gutting the vault right under the noses of the FBI, the unknown subject simply ceased operations. He vanished into the vibrant, booming landscape of 1950s America, taking a fortune in untraceable cash and leaving absolutely nothing behind but a heavily redacted, highly classified federal file. The FBI quietly boxed up the crime scene photos, the pristine 16mm surveillance reels, and the forensic reports, burying the case deep within their archives to protect the illusion of federal infallibility. The 1950s bank robber remains one of the greatest, most terrifyingly perfect unsolved mysteries in the history of American true crime. He was a man who understood that true power doesn't come from a loaded gun. It comes from understanding the mechanical weaknesses of the systems we trust the most. He didn't just steal money. He stole the absolute certainty of the era, proving that no matter how thick the steel or how complex the lock, there is always a ghost capable of walking right through the walls. If this deep dive into the classified, noir-soaked archives of the 1950s FBI left you questioning the history you were taught, hit that subscribe button and join us here at the Wayne Archive. We will continue to pull the forgotten files from the shadows and expose the brilliant, terrifying crimes the authorities desperately wanted to hide. Review the evidence, analyze the timeline, and drop your ultimate theory on the Phantom's true identity in the comments section below. Thank you for stepping into the archive with us today. And remember, the past is never as secure as it seems.